She was given to a useless lord. Then he proved to be the strongest heart in the room. The cavernous church was a theater of shame exuding public humiliation, bitter resignation, and a cold, silent fury. From the prison of his wheelchair, Lord Alistair Blackwood watched the farce of his own wedding, his face a mask of stone. Every tick of the clock was a countdown to the end of this final degradation, a joke orchestrated by lesser men. He wasn't just crippled. He was caged, and this strange, unknown woman was to be his keeper. The ghost of a memory haunted him of thunderous hooves, a sickening crack, and then nothing. That fall had cost him more than his legs. It had cost him his future, turning him from a lord into a local legend of loss. Then he saw her, the bride. Not a schemer, not a shrew. Just a girl with quiet eyes that held her own story of sorrow. They were two broken souls handed a raw deal and meant to be each other's final humiliation. But as he saw the flicker of unbroken grit in her gaze, a dangerous question took root. What if this joke was a loaded gun, pointed right back at the town that pulled the trigger? The church smelled of dust and judgment. A pale, unforgiving light streamed through the tall plain-glass windows, illuminating the worn pews and the faces of the silent watchers. They had all come to see the joke, the final act in a town's cruel little play. Eliza Mayhew stood at the altar. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white stones. She felt their eyes on her, 100 tiny pinpricks of pity and scorn. She was a debt paid in full. Her father's name cleared in exchange for her own. Her groom was a statue carved from shadow. Lord Alistair Blackwood sat in his chair of oak and steel, his broad shoulders rigid, his face turned away toward the window, as if the vast empty plains held more interest than the woman he was about to marry. She had only seen him from a distance before a dark, brooding figure, the crippled lord of Blackwood Ranch. Up close, his silence was a physical force, a wall of ice she could feel from across the chancel. The pastor's words were a monotonous drone swallowed by the cavernous quiet. To have and to hold. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. Till death do us part. It sounded less like a vow and more like a sentence. When the moment came, he did not turn. He did not speak. He simply gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He did not look at her. Not once. The journey to the ranch was a silent pilgrimage into the heart of an immense and lonely landscape. The carriage wheels ground a slow rhythm against the gravel of a world that cared nothing for her. Mountains, like sleeping stone-skinned giants, loomed in the distance, their peaks dusted with the first stubborn snows of winter. Alistair sat opposite her, his gaze fixed on that unchanging horizon, his jaw set like granite. He was a man who had walled off the world, and she had just been sealed inside with him. The house was not a home. It was a fortress. Built of dark river stone and timber the color of storm clouds, it rose from the valley floor with a grim and solitary grandeur. Inside, the air was cold, smelling of beeswax, old leather, and secrets. A stern gray-haired woman named Mrs. Gable met them at the door. "Welcome to Blackwood, ma'am," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. She did not look at Alistair, who was wheeled away by a silent ranch hand. "I will show you to your rooms." The plural felt deliberate. A confirmation. Her room was in the east wing. It was beautiful, larger than any space she had ever lived in, with a four-poster bed and a window that looked out onto a walled garden now barren and skeletal in the autumn chill. It was a gilded cage. "The master takes his meals in the library," Mrs. Gable stated, her hands folded neatly at her waist. "Your tray will be brought to you here. If you require anything, you may pull the cord by the hearth." And then Eliza was alone. Utterly, completely alone. The silence of the great house pressed in heavier than any sound. She walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the sky bleed from gray to a deep, starless purple. She had not cried at the wedding. She would not cry now. Crying was a luxury for those who still had hope. But as the night deepened, a restlessness took hold. This gilded silence was a kind of madness. She slipped from her room, her bare feet soundless on the polished floorboards. The house was a maze of sleeping shadows. She walked without direction, a ghost in her own life, until she saw it. A single thin line of golden light from beneath a heavy oak door down the west hallway. The library, his sanctuary. She crept closer, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. She held her breath, listening. There was no voice, no movement. Just the faintest, softest whisper of a page being turned. He was in there awake, separated from her by nothing more than a few inches of carved wood. But it felt like a canyon, vast and impossible to cross. That sliver of light beneath the library door became a nightly vigil, a silent question. Eliza would stand in the cold, cavernous hallway, a ghost in her own home, listening to the whisper-soft sound of turning pages. She never knocked. The door was his fortress, the silence his shield, and she was an intruder in his kingdom of grief. To breach that wall felt like a violation she was not yet brave enough to commit. So each night she would retreat, the golden line of light fading behind her, leaving her to the company of shadows. Days bled into a quiet, aching routine. She learned the rhythms of the house, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle in the morning mist, the stern but efficient footsteps of Mrs. Gable. She learned the geography of her cage, exploring the rooms that slept under white dust cloths, their furniture like pale, shrouded corpses. It was in one of these forgotten rooms that she found it. The grand ballroom. It was a place of ghosts, its tall windows weeping with dust, the parquet floor a faded chessboard of forgotten dances. And in the center a colossal shape beneath a canvas shroud. A grand piano. She lifted a corner of the cloth. The wood was dark, rich mahogany, but the ivory keys were yellowed like old teeth. She pressed one. A single discordant note thudded into the silence, flat and hollow. A sound of profound brokenness. It felt like a kindred spirit. The storm arrived without warning, a snarling beast descending from the mountains. Rain lashed against the glass, and the wind howled a lonely, violent ballad around the stone corners of the house. Sleep was impossible. The storm outside was a mirror to the one inside her, a tempest of loneliness and uncertainty. Drawn by an impulse she didn't understand, Eliza lit a single candle and made her way back to the ballroom. The room was alive now, the wind rattling the window frames, the shadows thrown by her candle dancing like frantic specters. She sat before the piano, the shroud pooled at her feet. She was not a musician, not really. But her mother had taught her a simple lullaby, a melody that was the only inheritance she had left. Her fingers, hesitant and cold, found the keys. The piano's voice was a ghost of what it once was, out of tune. Melancholic, each note a slightly pained cry. Yet she played. She played the simple melody for herself, for the ghosts in the room, for the howling wind. It was a small act of defiance, a whisper of life against the oppressive silence of the house. The final note faded, its dissonant echo hanging in the air, and she knew she was not alone. She didn't hear him arrive. The storm had covered his sound. But she felt him, a presence in the doorway darker than the other shadows. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Alistair. He sat in his wheelchair just beyond the edge of the candlelight, his face half hidden in gloom. She could not read his expression. Anger, annoyance. Her fingers froze over the keys, bracing for the harsh dismissal she was sure would come. The silence that followed was not empty, but resonant, stretched taut between the sound of the rain and their two heartbeats. He finally moved, wheeling himself just far enough into the light for her to see his face. There was no anger there, only a deep, soul-shattering weariness and something else she couldn't name, an echo of pain. His voice when he spoke was rough, a rasp of stone on stone, as if he hadn't used it for anything but commands in years. My mother, he said the words low and heavy. She used to play that song. He did not say more. He didn't have to. He had offered her a piece of his past, a shard of a memory from before the fall. He watched her for another long moment, his gray eyes holding an unfathomable depth. Then he turned his chair with a soft whir of wheels and was gone, leaving her alone with the rain, the out-of-tune piano, and the ghost of a connection that now hung fragile and shimmering in the air between them. The storm broke more than just the sky. It broke the oppressive, suffocating silence of Blackwood Manor. In the morning, the world was washed clean, the air tasting of wet earth and pine. When Eliza came downstairs, she found Alistair not in his library, but in the vast, empty dining room. He sat at a small table near the windows, a solitary island in a sea of polished wood, a cup of coffee steaming before him. It was a gesture she knew, a deliberate step out of his fortress. She took her own seat at the far end of the long table, the distance between them still a chasm, but now at least they were in the same room. "The creek will be running high," he said, his voice still holding the rough texture of disuse. He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the rain-soaked valley. "Yes," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. The land was thirsty. As were we, she thought. But the relief the storm brought was a fleeting, cruel mirage. The sky sealed itself shut and the sun returned with a vengeance. Days turned into weeks of relentless, shimmering heat. The high creek withered to a muddy ribbon, then a cracked and peeling scar. The vibrant green of the valley faded to the color of brittle straw. A dry, rasping cough seemed to rise from the land itself. The drought had come, and it was a slow, silent killer. The life of the ranch, once a distant hum, now became an encroaching anxiety. She saw the worry etched on the faces of the ranch hands, heard the low, distressed calls of the cattle. She saw the tension in Alistair's shoulders, the way his hands would clench on the wheels of his chair as he stared out his library window at his dying kingdom. One evening, the foreman, an old leather-faced man named Silas, came to the library. Eliza was reading by the fire and made to leave, but Alistair's sharp gesture stopped her. "Stay." Silas twisted his hat in his hands, his gaze on the floor. "The north well is down to mud, my lord. The cattle, they're starting to fall. We'll lose the herd if we don't get rain in a fortnight." A heavy silence descended. It was a death sentence. Eliza watched Alistair. She expected to see despair, or perhaps the cold resignation she had seen at their wedding. Instead, she saw a fire ignite in his gray eyes, a spark of the fierce, commanding intelligence she had only glimpsed. "Leave it with me, Silas," he said, his voice sharp with sudden purpose. For the next 2 days, the library became his war room. He had Silas bring him chests of old family journals, territorial surveys, and geological maps. He unrolled the brittle yellowed papers across the vast oak desk, his long, pale fingers tracing the forgotten waterways and contour lines of the land. He worked with a feverish, focused intensity a man possessed. He did not eat. He barely slept. Eliza watched him, fascinated, bringing him coffee and food that he would ignore. She was seeing the man he was, before the fall, a lord of his domain, his mind his only weapon. On the third night he summoned her. The desk was a chaotic tapestry of maps held down by books. The main aquifers failing, he began without preamble. His finger tapped a faded line on a survey from 50 years prior. But my grandfather wrote of another, a deep spring hidden in the granite heart of the North Canyons. He called it the Stoneheart Spring. The ranchers who came after him thought it was just a tall tale. I don't. He finally looked up at her, his eyes blazing. "I cannot ride there, but you can." Eliza's heart hammered. This was more than a request. It was an offering of trust. "The land is treacherous," he warned. "The canyons are a maze. Silas will think I'm a fool chasing a ghost story. He pushed a smaller hand-drawn map across the desk towards her. "I need you to be my eyes. I need you to go where I cannot." She learned the land from his desk. She spent days in the saddle, the sun a hammer against her back, her muscles screaming in protest. Each evening, she would return exhausted and covered in dust, and they would work by lamplight. "The rock here changes," she'd say, her finger tracing a path on the map. "It's redder like he wrote. That's the iron deposit," he'd murmur, his mind racing. "Follow that vein west. Look for a stand of old aspens. Water forces them to the surface there." They were no longer master and unwanted bride. They were partners. A bond was being forged between them in the heat of the dying land, a connection built of shared purpose and whispered conversations in the dead of night. She began to see not a cripple in a chair, but a brilliant strategist. And he began to see her. After a week of failures, she followed a sliver of a game trail into a narrow, winding canyon he had marked as a final desperate possibility. The air grew cooler. She saw it then. A patch of impossible green moss clinging to the base of a sheer rock wall, and from a deep fissure in the stone a steady, clear trickle of water disappearing into the thirsty sand. It was real. She galloped back to the ranch, her horse's hooves a thunderous drumbeat of victory. She didn't wait for an invitation bursting into the library, her face flushed, her eyes wild with triumph. He looked up from his maps, startled. "I found it, Alistair," she gasped, leaning against the doorframe for support. "The aspens, the moss. I found the water." Alistair stared at her. The calculating fire in his eyes softened, replaced by something else, something raw and overwhelming. It wasn't just relief for his land, for his herd. It was a look of profound, staggering awe. It was the look of a man in a desert dying of thirst who had just been shown an ocean. And in that moment, he wasn't looking at the girl who was the symbol of his shame. He was looking at the woman who had just saved his world. The discovery of the Stoneheart Spring changed everything. The ranch, once gasping for life, drank deeply, and a fragile, hopeful green began to push through the parched brown earth. The work was hard, laying down pipes and troughs, but it was a shared labor. A new rhythm was born. Eliza was no longer a ghost in the hallways. She was a presence, her voice now a familiar sound in the courtyard, her boots dusty from riding the fence line. And Alistair was transformed. The library was still his domain, but it was no longer a tomb. It was the vibrant beating heart of the ranch, a place of strategy and planning. He and Eliza would spend hours poring over ledgers and maps, their heads bent close together under the warm lamplight. A quiet respect had bloomed between them, a partnership that felt more real and binding than the cold words the pastor had mumbled over them. She saw him smile once, a quick fleeting thing that barely touched his lips, but it lit his gray eyes with a startling warmth, and it made her own heart ache with a strange, unfamiliar hope. But as the days shortened and autumn arrived, painting the aspens in strokes of brilliant, aching gold, a shadow began to creep back into the corners of the house. A chill returned that had nothing to do with the weather. Alistair grew quiet again, the fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a distant, haunted look. He would sit for hours staring at the mountains, his hand resting on the atrophied muscle of his thigh, a gesture of unconscious, unending pain. The wall between them, so patiently dismantled, was being rebuilt stone by silent stone. His grief was a room she had no key for. One afternoon, she found Mrs. Gable polishing silver in the kitchen, her movements slow and deliberate. "He grows distant." Eliza said the words in admission of defeat. The housekeeper paused, her gaze softening with a rare pity. "It is the time of year, ma'am. The first snows will be on the peaks soon." She sighed, a sound heavy with years of witnessing this private sorrow. It was a day like this 3 years ago, the day of the fall, the anniversary. Eliza understood. It was not a retreat from her, but a retreat into a memory that held him prisoner. On the day itself, the house was as silent as a grave. Alistair did not leave the library. When Mrs. Gable knocked with his lunch tray, the door remained locked. Eliza felt his absence like a physical wound. The easy camaraderie they had built felt like a dream, and she had woken up to the cold reality of his unbroken pain. She could leave him to it. She could respect the solitude he so clearly craved. It would be the easy thing to do. But as dusk fell, painting the sky in bruises of purple and violet, she knew she could not. She would not let him face his ghosts alone. She went to the kitchen and prepared a tray herself. Not a grand meal, but a simple bowl of hot broth, a piece of fresh bread, and a heavy glass of the whiskey he sometimes drank. She carried it down the west hallway and placed it on the floor before the locked library door. Then she slid down to the floor, her back against the cold wall opposite, and began her vigil. She did not knock. She did not call his name. She simply sat in the growing darkness, a silent promise shouted into the deafening quiet of the house. I am here. You are not alone. Hours crawled by. The house grew cold. The moon rose, casting long skeletal shadows down the hall. She grew stiff, her limbs aching, but she did not move. Just after midnight, when she had begun to think he would remain entombed until morning, she heard it. A soft click. The slow, heavy scrape of the bolt being drawn. The door opened a few inches, spilling a sliver of weak firelight into the hall. He was there, his face haggard in the flickering light, his eyes pools of raw, unguarded agony. He saw the tray untouched. Then he saw her huddled across from him, her arms wrapped around her knees. A look of profound shattered disbelief crossed his features. You should not have... He rasped, his voice thick with unshed tears. I could not leave you, she whispered back. He opened the door wider. An invitation. She rose on stiff legs and entered. The room was cold, the fire in the great hearth little more than dying embers. He looked smaller in his chair, diminished by the weight of his memories. She called me a broken thing, he said suddenly, his voice a raw wound in the darkness. He stared into the embers, but he was seeing another face. My fiancé. She looked at me in the sickbed, and she said, I cannot be tethered to a broken thing. Then she was gone. He let out a breath that was half a sob. The friends who clapped my back and shared my brandy, they vanished too, replaced by pity. Pity is a poison, Eliza. It rots a man from the inside out. He finally turned to her, his composure utterly gone. This chair, this is not my prison. The prison is the memory of their faces, the memory of a life that was mine and then was not. He looked so utterly lost, a king exiled from his own body, his own life. Eliza's heart broke for him. Without thinking, moved by an instinct deeper than reason, she crossed the space between them. She knelt before his chair, and she did the one thing no one had dared to do. She reached out and took his hand. His skin was cold, but his grip when it closed around hers was surprisingly strong. A current passed between them, a shock of warmth and life in the cold, dead room. It was the first time they had ever truly touched. And in that simple, profound connection, beneath the weight of all his ghosts, a new story was finally beginning. The confession in the fire-starved library did not end with the dawn. It was itself a new dawn. The simple act of holding his hand in the darkness had unlatched a door between them, and in the days that followed they did not allow it to swing shut again. His pain, once a secret solitary ghost, was now a story shared, and its power to haunt was lessened by half. The house, as if taking its cue from its master, began to wake from a long slumber. Eliza, feeling a sense of belonging for the first time, grew bolder. She untied the white dust cloths from the parlor furniture, letting the deep reds and blues of the velvet breathe again. She discovered a trove of china in a forgotten pantry and began taking her meals with Alistair in the dining room, the long, polished table between them, no longer a chasm but a shared continent. She brought wildflowers in from the Valley Indian paintbrush, and wild lupine, placing them in dusty vases, their vibrant, untamed color, a quiet rebellion against the house's solemn gray. Alistair watched her, a quiet, wondering look in his eyes. He began to emerge. The library was no longer his world, but merely a room within it. He would ask her to wheel him out to the verandas where they would sit for hours. He taught her the names of the mountains that cradled their valley, the sleeping giant, the widow's peak, and the histories of the men who had named them. He spoke of his father's dreams for the ranch dreams he himself had long since buried. Their affection grew not in grand declarations, but in the soil of small, quiet gestures. One morning, she came down to find a heavy parcel by her door. Inside was a cloak of the finest, softest wool, the color of a stormy sea lined with silk. It was impossibly warm, a shield against the coming winter. There was no note, but when she wore it into the dining room, the small, almost imperceptible nod he gave her was more eloquent than a love letter. In return, she learned from a tight-lipped Mrs. Gable that he had once loved the simple apple tarts his mother used to bake. Eliza spent an afternoon in the vast, unfamiliar kitchen, her hands clumsy with flour and dough, a frustrating, near-disastrous effort that finally produced 6 slightly misshapen but fragrant tarts. When she served one to him that evening with his coffee, he closed his eyes at the first bite, and she saw the memory of another time, another love wash over his face. He did not speak of it, but he ate every last crumb. He was giving her protection. She was giving him back his past peace by gentle peace. One afternoon a man arrived in a dusty wagon, a stranger with calloused, careful hands. He was a piano tuner from a town 2 days' ride away. Eliza watched bewildered as he spent hours in the ballroom coaxing the broken instrument back to life, one string at a time. The master arranged. It was all Mrs. Gable would say, a rare, knowing smile touching her lips. The gift left Eliza breathless. It was a gesture of such profound, tender understanding. He was not just mending an object. He was acknowledging the night of the storm, the moment their story had truly begun. He was telling her without words that her small attempts at beauty mattered. That night she was drawn back to the ballroom. The air was still and expectant. She sat at the piano, and under her hesitant fingers, the simple lullaby of her mother emerged. But this time it was not a broken cry. The notes were clear, round, and perfect, a melody of pure, sweet sorrow that filled the silent house not with grief, but with healing. She was so lost in the music she did not hear the sound behind her. Not the soft whir of wheels, but something else, a soft, rhythmic thump, the sound of wood on wood. She turned, and her heart stopped. Alistair was standing in the doorway. He was not in his chair. He was on his feet, leaning heavily on a pair of dark polished crutches, his body trembling with the colossal effort. His face was pale, beaded with sweat, but his eyes were fixed on her, burning with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. He had fought a war against gravity, against atrophied muscle, against the memory of his own breaking, just to stand before her. Slowly, painfully, he made his way across the floor, each step a testament of will. He stopped when he reached the piano. You mended the silence in this house," he said, his voice strained but clear. "I thought it only fair to mend the instrument." He looked down at the keys, then back at her, his soul naked in his eyes. "For 3 years I have been a ghost, a memory. You walked into my life and you did not see a ghost, Eliza. You saw a man. You taught me how to breathe again." Tears streamed down her face. "I never saw a broken man, Alistair," she whispered. "I only saw the strongest heart I had ever known." He reached out a trembling hand, not to the crutch, but to her face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. "Then let that heart be yours," he said, his voice breaking, "because it already is. I love you, Eliza, and I love you," she cried softly. Leaning on his crutches, he bent down, and in the golden lamplight of the forgotten ballroom, surrounded by the ghosts of what was and the promise of what could be, he kissed her. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a vow of a shared future, the final perfect note in a song that had at last found its harmony. The kiss in the ballroom was not an ending, but an unlocking. It was the key to rooms they had not known were still sealed shut within themselves, rooms that now flooded with light. Winter came to the valley, blanketing the world in a deep and peaceful silence. But for the first time in years, the great stone house of Blackwood Ranch was not cold. It was a haven, a sanctuary warmed by a fire that had nothing to do with the logs burning in the hearths. Love, Eliza discovered, was a quiet, practical thing. It was in the way Alistair would have a fresh pot of coffee waiting for her when she came in from her morning rides, his hands having mastered the complex mechanics of the kitchen's coffee grinder from his chair. It was in the way she would read the newspaper to him by the fire in the evenings, her voice a soft melody weaving through the day's dry news. It was in the shared laughter over a clumsy mistake, the easy silence of two people who no longer needed words to understand one another. He taught her the intricate genealogies of his cattle. She taught him the simple lullaby her mother had sung. They were building a life, a real life, from the ashes of a cruel joke. He never used the crutches again. That single monumental effort in the ballroom had been a singular act, a statement. His victory was not in learning to stand again, but in learning that his worth was not measured by his legs. His strength was his mind, his heart, and now it was her. When the first thaws of spring arrived, melting the snow from the peaks and turning the valley into a tapestry of tender green, an invitation came. It was printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, the calligraphy ornate. An invitation to the annual Founders' Day dance, the preeminent social event of the season, to be held at the mayor's own residence. Eliza saw the shadow pass over Alistair's face, the familiar tightening of his jaw. "We'll burn it," he said, his voice flat. "It is a summons to our own execution. I will not have them stare at you, at us. I will not suffer their pity." Eliza placed her hand over his, stilling the nervous clenching of his fingers. The frightened girl who had stood at the altar months ago was gone. In her place was the mistress of Blackwood, a woman who had faced down a dying land and a broken man's grief. She would not be cowed by gossip. "It is not pity they will see," she said softly, her gaze firm. "Pity is for the weak Alistair, and we are not weak." She leaned forward, her voice dropping, filled with a fierce conviction. "They tried to make a spectacle of our pain. I want them to bear witness to our joy. Let them stare. Let them see what their joke has wrought." He searched her eyes, and in their clear, determined depths he found a strength that bolstered his own. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Then they shall have a sight to see." The night of the dance, the house was filled with a quiet, nervous energy. He wore a fine dark woolen jacket that made his shoulders seem even broader, his silver hair impeccably brushed. He looked every inch the lord he was born to be. For her he had a gift waiting on the bed, a dress the color of a twilight sky, simple and elegant, and a delicate silver locket that had belonged to his mother. As she put it on, she saw not the reflection of a bartered bride in borrowed rags, but a woman loved. Their arrival at the mayor's house silenced the room. The music of the string quartet faltered for a beat. Every head turned. A wave of whispers rippled through the crowded space. Eliza felt a tremor of her old fear, but then she felt Alistair's hand find hers, his grip firm and steady. He wheeled his chair into the center of the room as if he were a king entering his court. Eliza walked beside him, her head held high, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. They were not two broken halves. They were a single, unbreakable unit. The mayor bustled forward, his face a mask of false, florid welcome. "Lord Blackwood and the lovely Mrs. Blackwood, how unexpected. We are so honored you could join us." Alistair looked up at the man who had authored his humiliation, his gray eyes as cool and clear as a mountain lake. "It is good to see the town thriving, Mayor," he said, his voice calm and carrying. "A harsh winter can have a way of culling the weak, leaving only what is strong enough to endure." The veiled insult, delivered with perfect aristocratic grace, hit its mark. The mayor's face flushed, and for the first time he seemed to be at a loss for words. The crowd watching saw not a cripple but a man of immense power. They saw not a pitiable bride, but a woman of quiet, unshakable dignity. The whispers changed. The pity was gone, replaced by a grudging, astonished respect. They did not stay long. They had done what they came to do. They had shown the world their truth. Later they sat on the veranda of their own home, the distant tinny sound of the party's music carried on the breeze. The sky above was a vast, silent cathedral of stars. The air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. "They thought they were writing our ending that day in the church," he said, his voice a low murmur in the peaceful dark. Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. "They were," she whispered, "the ending of a sad story and the beginning of a better one." He turned his head, his lips finding hers in a soft, certain kiss. In the valley below, the lights of the town seemed small and insignificant. Here, on their land, under the vast benevolent sky, they had their own world, a world built not of wealth or status, but of a quiet, enduring, and triumphant love. The harvest of their harsh season had at last come in.